This is Professor Ludlum. This is the Law of International Business Transactions, LS 4533. Today we're going to look at some of the concepts in Chapter 8 that students have had difficulty with over the time. Now, Chapter 8 talks about the political process of making these rules. And of course, this means it's a domestic law. It's U.S. rules on when we can have a treaty. And of course, one of our big disputes is who can institute a treaty? Can the president do it by himself? And the historical answer is no. The way our process works is the executive, the president, makes a policy, but then the Senate ratifies the treaty. But oftentimes this dispute happens of what exactly are the powers of the president to act alone, what are the powers of the legislature to act alone when it deals with foreign powers. First and foremost, the power to negotiate treaties, again agreements between nations, is left to the executive branch. So the president or through his trade representatives are the ones that actually negotiate the treaties. Now, one of the concepts in this chapter that people always stumble on is the equal dignity rule. The equal dignity rule means that the laws passed by Congress and a treaty have equal dignity. And so when they conflict, which one wins? It's the one that's most recent in time. So a treaty that's made in 1850 versus a statute that's passed in 2015, the statute wins out if those two conflict. Again, with the idea that both the treaty and the statutes have equal dignity, but the most recent one means it had to acknowledge the prior one, and so it knows they conflict. And so the most recent one wins in case of a conflict. The reason why people stumble over this is if you just Google equal dignity rule, there's a reference, we use that same nomenclature to talk about agency and principal relationships. And so there's something in agency and principal relationships that talks about equal dignity. But in our context, it deals with the power of the laws versus the treaties. For most nations, our first step is FCN treaties, right? Friendship, commerce, and navigation. These are the vague treaties that literally a lot of times only contain one or two sentences that say, our two nations agree to work together in areas of friendship, commerce, and navigation. Again, very general, no specifics, but it does acknowledge that we think this country is independent and represents their own interest rather than being a part of another country. For example, when South Sudan splits away from Sudan to become an independent country, our first step in recognizing them will be an FCN treaty. Now, what can the president do, acting alone? Our best case example is involving Jimmy Carter, peanut farmer from Georgia. What happened? Well, again, this is 1970s. To understand the case, you really have to go back to World War II. But Hungary, during the end of World War II, was having a difficult time, again, horribly torn apart by the ravages of World War II. They gave a bunch of their royal properties, again, basically a big box of sacred things for the Hungarian government. They gave them to the U.S. government as safekeeping because they were afraid in the reorganization after the end of the war that things might disappear or get destroyed. Our government kept them safe. And finally, in the 70s, one of the Hungarian diplomats met with President Carter and basically expressed an interest to give those back. President Carter agreed and said he was announcing a little press conference where he gave back this box of sacred goodies back to the Hungarian people. Bob Dole, who was leader of the Senate, later to run for president, challenged him, saying what President Carter is doing is essentially giving property that's in the possession of the U.S. government to a foreign country. That amounts to a treaty, and in order to do that, he's got to have the Senate ratify it. he can't act alone. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yes, generally, for treaties, a president does have to have the Senate confirmation. But there are some things a president can do acting alone, in this example being one, of things that are small in nature, don't involve extended commitment, don't involve a financial commitment of the United States, but again are just small powers that the president has to act autonomously. And so giving back those goodies to the Hungarian people was within his power as the executive, even without the Senate conferring it. Now, obviously, every time there's a crisis, there's a dispute between when the White House wants to act alone and when the legislature says, no, they have to have their approval in order to act, and that's a debate that continues through this day. One of the big changes that's happened in 1962, we created the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, or basically this is our agent on behalf of the United States to go around and make economic agreements or economic treaties with other countries instead of having the president and those kind of folks do it. Instead, we have a financial person do that on behalf of the government. One other issue that we have quite a bit, again, stems from the problems that occurred during that time. The IEEPA, International Emergency Economic Powers Act, was created in 1977. Again, you're not old enough to remember those days, but this is immediately following the oil crisis. And so we needed a lot of emergency economic powers because when OPEC formed and quadrupled the price of oil, our economy was caught flat-footed. And as a result, it basically put our economy on a complete grinding halt very quickly, and we needed some power that the president could act, again, alone without waiting for the Senate to authorize it in cases of economic emergency. The last concept that it mentions in this chapter is when we have court reviews of cases involving treaty obligations that are financial in nature, dumping, these kinds of things. It's done through the Court of International Trade. This is one of our specialized courts located in New York City. Again, these are specialists involving all the treaty interpretation that have financial aspects. So instead of going to your local courthouse, either in Edmond, Oklahoma, or Chicago, Illinois, or wherever the goods are, instead you go to a specialized court that all they do is handle international trade transactions. This is the Court of International Trade's website. Again, it's very easy to access, nothing's password protected, but it has lots of information. Again, this is a specialized court located in New York City that handles all the international trade cases. So again, these judges, as well as all their staff, are specialists in all the issues related to international trade. One of the good things about it, especially from a lawyer standpoint, is it's very easy to search these. All the court opinions are here, and they're all organized by year. So literally, if you know the case, what year it came out, and the date, you can pretty much flip right to it because they're all organized by date. Here, the most recent one as of today was literally yesterday's opinion. And you can access the documents. You can print them. You can search them by specific judges, by specific topics. It makes it very easy to do research. Again, this gives you years' worth of all the Court of International Trade opinions, full documents. From a lawyer standpoint, this makes things very easy to research. But again, that's Court of International Trade as a big source of information. And if you have any research needs for those, be sure and look that up.